Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Kendra, and I'm going to be talking about natural dyeing through the lens of eco consciousness. Uh, a little bit about me: I've been a natural dyer for almost 10 years now. I really like the intersection of using the plants that I can grow and find in nature, as well as being very intentional about where I'm sourcing my fibers and how I'm making my dyes. And that's what we're going to talk about today. This is the outline we'll be using today, which is a general overview of the dye process in natural dyeing. Maybe you're familiar with natural dyeing, maybe you're not, but it is a little bit more complicated than our traditional or acid dye processes. So we'll talk about where we source our dye, where do we actually get the materials that we're going to use to make the colors. We'll talk about where we source our textiles from, some different options for that. We'll talk about textile preparation. Preparation is a big part of natural dyeing because we actually need to make our colors stick onto our fibers, and there are many environmental considerations when we are in that stage of the preparation. We'll also talk about water. Obviously, water is going to be a large part of anything that we're considering from an environmental or ecological standpoint. And then we'll also mention energy source. So I made this little graphic because these parts of natural dyeing all come together for our overall how we see our dye process, how we see our business evolving within an eco-friendly manner. And so things that we'll take into consideration is the local environment. What does that look like for you? It's going to be different for everybody. Different areas, like I mentioned, that we can be eco-conscious or eco-friendly. And then also what our dyeing goals are. If we're doing small batch dyeing for ourselves, for our friends, our family, that's going to look a lot different than if we're trying to do more production dyeing for sale or for even larger types of things. It also will depend on what we use to prepare our materials, can depend on what we're going to use those materials for. So do we need increased durability, increased wash fastness, light fastness? Those are some of the things that we'll talk about. So we'll start with our dye source. Just a few images here. All of the images that I've included in this talk are pictures that I've taken either from my own dye garden in preparation for my dyes, or the dyes that I've foraged locally. So just in this photo, we have some flowers, coreopsis. In the middle, we have madder root. And then we have some drying flowers using a solar drying method to save flowers for later for dyeing. There are a lot of different dye sources that we can use. So a lot of things that we can do, we can grow in our own garden. That is actually where I came to the natural dye process. I was a gardener first and foremost. And so using garden grown dyes is a great way to keep the process really, really local. So really micro niche local. And this works not just, of course, I'm based in Minnesota, but all over the country, different people can grow things that are going to do best in their garden. So here's just a short little list of the things that I grow, but there are more dye plants out there. And all of these have their own considerations. So many of these plants are also really, really great pollinators. So we can help especially our native bees, our butterflies, and your dye garden can actually double as a pollinator garden as well. There are a few dye plants that we need to be a little wary of from an ecological standpoint. One that comes to mind for me is one that's called woad, or Isatis tinctoria. That plant actually can be a weed, and it's labeled as a noxious weed in the West. So basically West Rocky Mountains and West, because it can take over natural habitat. So some other things to consider there. Other sources that we can find our dye plants locally foraged are great ones. Many of the plants that surround us in nature actually have dye in them. So goldenrod, black walnut being examples. A good rule of thumb when foraging for natural plants would be to take no more than 10% of any local plant growing. The not included in that rule is going to be something like buckthorn, which is a native or an invasive plant in this area. And so buckthorn, I think we can probably take as much as we want. Other places that we can find dye that is great to prevent things from going into the waste stream would be food waste. Onion skins, avocado are a couple of the big ones, pomegranate husks. So we can find things to dye with right within our own kitchens. And then I also included, we can think about when we're doing natural dye, different orderings, mail orderings, dye extracts, powders, etc. Obviously, these are going to have a larger footprint as far as the carbon chain and on the environment. Just a few words here about our different types of dye sources, because this will make the next section make more sense. So in the natural dye world, our dyes are broadly separated into two different categories. We have substantive and we have adjective. Substantive dyes basically can dye without what's called a mordant, and that's just something that I'll talk about really soon here. Adjective need a mordant, so it's an extra step, it's an extra impact upon the environment. So just to kind of briefly categorize, we have a lot of our tree-based types of things in that first category, and then many of our flower dyes in the second category. So moving on to textile selection, there are many different textiles, obviously, that we can put dye upon. And there's even more than this, obviously. People are going to be, working with leather or wood or making paints, all of those sorts of things. But I've just included a few. So, a raw fleece, cotton, and these are actually silkworm cocoons. So these are all examples of different things that we can use to dye with. Of our fibers, when we're doing natural dyeing, it's important to realize what type of fiber we're actually working with. So the first category would be our protein fibers. And the easy way to think about that is that is basically anything that is made by an animal. Wool, llama, silk, all of those types of things. The second category are cellulose fibers, cotton, linen, basically anything that comes from a plant. This is important because the chemistry between the two, protein and cellulose, is different. And so they are going to take dyes differently, and we are going to need to prepare them differently as well. So some things that we can think about when we are selecting our textiles is where, first of all, is the fiber coming from? Obviously, if we want to decrease our overall carbon footprint, then finding local sources of fiber is going to be the way to go. And fortunately, there are more sources now than there have been for a while. So there's a little bit of a renaissance right now with our local fiber producers, local groupings of fiber producers, and local fiber mills. There have been a lot of shutdowns, and in the times of the current economy, it can be hard for these places to make ends meet. So it is important to support them however we can, because it is a great resource, especially for those of us who are doing this dye work. So I have included here, as far as on the local side, our local Three Rivers Fibershed, which is a grouping of shepherds and wool producers and natural dye producers and dyers who've come together to kind of group together and try to get the word out there for this local product. Beyond really more hyper-local, we have USA made and sourced. And so these are just a few of the local or in the USA places that I work with, but there are many more out there. Another great source for textiles, if we're trying to keep things green, is thrifted textiles. So there are a very large number of thrifted items that are going to waste or being thrown away, and we can potentially use these in our practice. And then, of course, we have the worldwide sources, which might be necessary if you're looking for a certain thing, but might you might find something closer to home too as well. So once we have our fiber, what do we do with it? So in natural dyeing, there are many steps to fiber preparation, and these are going to be some of the places where we can really think about our ecological impact. All right, so once we have our fiber, what do we do with our fiber? So I mentioned before there's several steps to this. The first one is scouring or cleaning. So we really just want to get all of the oils, dirt, lanolin, all of that off of our fibers. Then we have mordanting. Mordanting is what we are going to use as a chemical process to actually make the dye stick to the fiber. So most mordants are going to be metal salts, and we'll get more into that. Other ways we can prepare the fiber is going to be soy, and then there's a mordant-free way that we can use natural dyes, which is more of an acid dyeing process. Alum is going to be the most common mordant. That is what most natural dyers are using. It produces a really bright color, and it is fairly non-toxic. Now, the problem with aluminum from an ecological standpoint is that it is mined. So this is something that is actually removed from the earth. It is very abundant, but mining practices can have their downsides. I've included a link here, which you might be interested in learning more. So the question for me is, how do we use alum? It really is the far and away the best mordant that we can use for our natural dye practice, but how do we use this responsibly? So considerations that we can take would be using lower percentages of alum. Some of the conventional dye literature talks about up to 20% weight of fiber, so alum to how much your fiber weighs, but we can get that a lot lower. We can recharge dye baths, so using the same pot with the alum in it over and over to dye additional rounds of fiber. We can use rinse water from one of the baths for the next mordant bath. It already is going to have some alum in there. The good news is that alum is safe for disposal into wastewater treatment, especially in city settings. They actually use aluminum to bind some of the more toxic things in the wastewater. One of the cool things that is interesting is that there are aluminum accumulators in the natural world, in the plant world. So some of these plants actually pick up metal, aluminum from the soil, from their roots, and actually keep that in their leaves. So there are some examples where we can simply just use plants to do our mordanting process for us. We also have tannin, which is an awesome thing that is found in many woody plants. And tannin acts as a mordant assist. So especially on those cellulose fibers that I talked about, cotton, linen, the tannin actually helps to bridge and make sure that the mordant and the dye sticks better to the fiber. So this is a great method to use if you're dyeing, if you want to use cotton, if you want to use linen. And the tannin, fortunately, is found in many plants, some that are available locally, including our sumacs. Another completely plant-based method of natural dyeing would be using a protein binding, and the most common source of protein binding is soy milk. So this is a mechanical versus a chemical source of fixation for the dye, so it tends to not be as long lasting. But this can be a really great process, again, depending on what your goals are for dyeing. If you are interested in providing more muted colors, or colors that you're okay if they're going to fade over time, which might be part of the process, this could be a great option. And then finally, that plant-based acid dye. So in traditional dyeing, we have a very acidic bath. We have our dye powders. They form a chemical compound to the yarn that is mediated by actually electrical attraction. And we can do the same thing in natural dyes. It does become a little bit more restrictive as far as which dyes we are going to use. It's only going to work with certain dyes, and it does only work on protein fibers. So again, those animal-based fibers. But that could be a really neat method if you are interested in moving completely away from metal mordants. All right, so water obviously is has a huge amount of ecological impact, and I'm not going to get into all the different methods that we can use to think about water use in our practice, but I am going to mention just a few things that we can do to make that more eco-friendly. So the first thing is, where do we get our water? So our water sourcing can be a lot of different places, but other than the tap, rain barrels, rain collection, especially if you're in a rain-heavy area. This summer in Minnesota, we were blessed with a lot of rain. My rain barrels have been full all summer, but that could be a great source of water. It is also a soft source of water. If you live somewhere that has hard water, that can actually impact your natural dye practice. You might get different colors. Maybe they're better colors, maybe not. But using rainwater typically is going to be a softer source. Dehumidifiers can be another good source. So that dehumidifier in your basement can actually produce water that you can use in your dye practice. Clean wastewater, so rinsing from fruits, veggies, that sort of thing. Maybe even ponds or lakes. In natural dyeing, we do need to consider, though, that small amounts of minerals, small amounts of things like iron can really change our colors. So we just have to be aware of that and ready for that. Continuing on then for water conservation, we can use all of these different methods to see if we can get our water usage down. Water is a big part of the natural dye process because there's so many steps, and each of those steps need water. So it's really important to be conscientious about how we are using that water. So we can, reuse those mordant pots like I talked about. We can do one pot dyeing. We put the mordant, the flowers, the fiber all in one pot together. Or printing or painting can be a much more water-friendly way to get our colors on than just immersion dyeing, where we put the dyes right into, or the fiber into the water bath. Some additional things we can do to conserve water: dry the fibers before rinsing, uses less in the rinse cycle, being conscious about where we discard it, and actually using our leftover to create paints and further products that we can use. For energy source, a lot of the natural dyeing will use a source of heat. So, this can be a traditional source of heat, but we can also think about alternative sources. So solar dyeing would be a big one, letting the sun do the work for us. It might take more time, but especially in an area where we might be shorter on water, etc., this can be a great conservation method. We can also use flower or leaf pounding, where we just indeed put the flower on our treated textile, and the energy is us mechanically pounding that leaf into the fiber. There are many dyers who are working with fermentation, so basically bundle dyeing, where they're wrapping up their fiber and their leaves and their dye materials, putting it in the compost pile and waiting, and taking that out after a certain amount of time to get actually the dyes that they want. And the heat and the time in that fermentation is what gives us that energy. So I've obviously only scratched the surface of a lot of the different ways that we can take our natural dyeing and make it even more eco-friendly than maybe it already is. So I've listed a few different resources here. Some of these are natural dyers. Some of these are dye companies. Of course, our local Fibershed. And if you are interested in any further information, please get a hold of me. I'm always more than happy to talk about this subject because I think it's fascinating, and there's more we can do. There's always more that we can learn. Every time I am thinking about this topic, I learn something new. And this is where you can find me. I am on social media, and I am also part of that Three Rivers Fibershed that I talked about. And then I will be at a few local events coming up. So if you are around there, come by and say hi. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful day.